What's going on, guys? It's Frito here for your Overwatch. We've had a lot of questions about the competitive mode and the Matchmaker. Blizzard just released a blog post, Overwatch 2 developer blog, Matchmaker and Competitive Deep Dive Part 1. They got a lot to talk about. It reads, in the first part of our two-part deep dive on matchmaking and competitive, we'll look at how matchmaking works under the hood and answer some outstanding questions around how MMR is determined and factored into the system. Ultimately, the goal of the Matchmaker is to create as fair matches as possible across all game modes. We know matchmaking can be a source of frustration, especially in competitive, and we'd like to recognize it doesn't always feel like it's meeting its goal. In order to address your thoughts, we needed to dissect the matchmaker and competitive systems separately before going into how they affect one another. In part 1, we talk about how the matchmaker works, some of the challenges we've faced, and some of the ways we're starting to tackle those issues. First section, internal matchmaking MMR. Our matchmaker is designed to create balanced matches. To do that, we need some approximation of each player's skill. Everyone has an internal matchmaking rating that's a numeric value to describe your skill relative to everyone else. However, MMR isn't an absolute value, meaning your MMR can change even if your personal skill stays the same. This could indicate the general population is getting better or worse compared to you. You can see this in the example below that displays the player MMR in quick play, with most of us around the middle of the curve. And this is a classic bell curve, which interestingly is weighted under 0. Not sure what that's trying to say about us, but also interestingly, I would point out that the extremes of the bell curve, okay, so where the orange line meets the baseline, it's hard to see because the line's so thick, but there's very, very few players in those outliers. So all the way on the left, that's going to be your bronzes, and the vanishingly small amount stretching out to the right, that's going to be what Flats likes to call the 10 stages of GM, because it gets more stratified even among that smaller player pool, because the ability between them is quite large, actually, despite them being kind of close in the overall scheme of things. And then the center of the bell curve, I think this sort of indicates most players are gold, and in fact, the majority chunk of the player base is in the metal ranks. Now, back to their explanation, they say your MMR will rise over time if you improve your skill and win more games against players of your current MMR level, which of course is just like how ELO works in chess, but MMR in competitive multiplayer games is much more fluid and adaptive than a traditional chess ELO system, which is like slower and more deliberate, I'd say. I bring that up because older matchmaking systems were a bit more brutal. And instead of matchmaking based on fairness of always pairing equal skilled opponents, you often would be match made based on ELO, which means the rewards would scale based on how unfair the match is. That's something that I think people really misinterpret often. In real competition, getting stomped by an unfair matchup is normal, because even if you're in the same weight division or league or whatever, the gap between performance is massive. What modern multiplayer games try to do in order to smooth that over would be like if in the sports league, the teams of similar skill played each other only, as opposed to like a tournament where you have to run through everybody and get to the top, and your matches get harder as time goes on and you eventually get beat down. That's more competitive in my opinion, but no one in gaming really wants that because it's not as fun and it treats the game like a job, which is what StarCraft 2 felt like. Okay, that's my little aside on MMR concepts. Let's get back to the blog post. It had just said your MMR will rise over time if you improve your skill and win more games against players of your current MMR. All our game modes, including competitive, only look at your MMR, which is invisible, when forming a match. We never use your outward-facing skill tier or division to form matches. Likewise, the rank you see in a player's profile isn't the same as their MMR. We only adjust your MMR after you win or lose a game, if you come back after not playing for a long time. Your MMR is unaffected when we lower your rank at the beginning of a season. I really don't like this part, and everyone in your matches has a similar MMR as you. Initial ranked matches can feel turbulent because many players return at the beginning of a season, and anything that changes player population is going to affect the matchmaker. It's also important to remember that our teammates are human. We don't always perform the same from game to game or even team fight to team fight. This inherent variance in our individual performance means that the matchmaker needs the results of as many games as possible to get an accurate representation of your skill. Now, while everything they just said is correct, I think a lot of us were under the impression that the skill reset on season wasn't just going to be for the rewards, but they would soft reset your MMR each season. Now, that has had mixed results, I'll be honest, not everyone likes it, but I thought it would at least be consistent to the perception of your skill rating going down, because the vanity number being reset just resets the reward, not the effort that's required. And these are conflicting values, of course, because Blizzard wants the matchmaker to work and be fair, because they're trying to make fair matches as opposed to the sometimes you get beat down competitive system that I described earlier. But the truth is, there just isn't any sort of thing like fairness in competition. You can have fair rules, but fair skill sets? Well, they play Pharah and you play Sim. There's nothing fair about that. Can the matchmaker determine those kinds of mismatches? I never get answers on these types of questions when I ask them, because I feel the entire concept of MMR fluctuates in its effectiveness based on the balanced state of the game. And what I mean by that is sometimes your hero pool can be favored in the meta, which I think will give you the illusion that you are better than your MMR and your MMR will go up. But then they rebalance the game and all of a sudden you're losing in matchups. In fact, maybe you can't even play the heroes that you were playing before. And the matchmaker's like, hey, get in there and put your games in and tell the matchmaker how good you are or aren't, and just play more, and then it'll all work out in the wash. Well, you can see how that's a problem, right? And we mentioned this for months and years before, so why are they surprised at this point? It's like, why aren't they ready for this counterpoint already, the thing that I'm saying? That's why I thought they were going to soft MMR reset on seasons, because they're adding a new hero, changing the game significantly. This is just inconsistent belief systems about how these are going to interact, right? Remember, I'm not the one who says randomly change up the balance of the game to, quote, keep it fresh. I don't like that. I think that's very silly. But they want to do that, and what's going to happen with that is that automatically MMR doesn't work. This is like a couple in a household where one person makes the money and the other one spends it. And you're going into debt, but you all need to cooperate. All right, next section, skill variation within groups. We love seeing you group and have fun together because we believe Overwatch 2 is a game best shared with friends. Grouping up does, however, influence the matchmaker in a few different ways. When players group together, there's the possibility that the group has a larger skill difference than a match we typically like to make. Those of you at the very highest levels might notice these skill differences more too, because there's far fewer players at the top of the MMR curve, which we saw in the graph earlier. We can't always avoid these types of matches, but we can make them feel better. These matches can often feel imbalanced if they create situations where there's a large discrepancy in skill within a single role between the teams. For example, we might match a highly rated tank against a comparably lower rated tank, so even if the overall match is balanced, the competition between tanks feels very one-sided. Which, yeah, that's a terrible idea for Overwatch 2 because of how pivotal the tank role is to everybody else, and you've weighted that position to put so much power in one player's hands. So obviously that's a bad idea. They go on to say, we've got changes coming to the game over the next few months, which will dramatically reduce these disparities. We'll try to find pairs of similarly rated players in each role when making a match. For support and damage roles, which have 2 slots, each player will be paired with one player on the opposite team. There will be sometimes matches with a large range of differently skilled players, but in these cases, the 2 teams will be more like mirror images of each other. Now, keep in mind, he's kind of talking about quick play mostly here, but it does apply to competitive where it applies, because obviously in competitive, you have a lot of restrictions on your MMR anyway, whereas this wide distribution of skill is mostly when you quick play group with friends. The blog post goes on, however, even with these improvements, there will always be times when we make matches that have a skill discrepancy or disparity that isn't reflected in MMRs because some players in the match aren't calibrated. So that means they haven't played enough matches in order for the system to even know where they really should be. We've seen this much more frequently since Overwatch 2 launched, and we welcomed a large influx of new players. Next section, setting up new players for success. Overwatch 2 is a lot to learn. It's a fast team-based hero shooter where players juggle the gameplay of a traditional FPS, the unique abilities of a diverse hero roster, and many different types of game modes and maps. We've tackled the learning curve from multiple directions to help ease new players into Overwatch 2. The most visible change was adding the first-time user experience at launch, but there's also an invisible change that we've been working on in the background, better matchmaking for new players. We noticed that new players were losing their initial matches much more than they should have, and this trend wasn't leveling out by the time they'd played many more matches. The win rates of new players should be normally distributed, meaning most players should hover around the 50% win rate, but instead, the distribution was skewed with new players losing at higher rates. It's almost like not knowing Overwatch at all makes you not very good at it. So like having any experience in Overwatch, no matter what your skill actually is, heavily biases you against the new players. I gotta imagine like just knowing that you should regroup in this game as like a general principle. Get with your team. And you got Warzone players coming in here being solo Q Andes, and that's going to be rough. The blog post goes on, this challenge is more difficult since the matchmaker has no initial data on player skill when they enter the first match. We've tried to remedy this issue with two distinct changes. First, new players initially started at an MMR value slightly below average. You can think of it in terms of skill tiers around the lower division of silver. This was already below the center point of the player base MMR distribution, but the new player win rate was still too low. Okay, so they thought they were silvers, but actually the new players were bronze. Can you believe it? We've since lowered the starting MMR to a rating equivalent to bronze 5 and instantly saw huge improvements for the new players starting with a sub 40% win rate. If you're playing with or against the new player in Overwatch 2, these games should now broadly feel fairer. Or be fairer. The second change we implemented was aiming at new players who did not belong at the initial MMR. Initial matches were weighted differently than standard matches because they increase and decrease MMR at a much higher rate than usual. We want to adjust a player's MMR as quickly as possible because until their MMR is more properly calibrated, we're not able to make fair matches. So if you don't know, in Overwatch 2 especially, I would say there was a pretty severe boost or bust period at the start of competitive. And that's how it would feel every season if they reset your internal MMR, which I think they should soft reset it at least to be consistent. So at least you can get the feeling of your match difficulty adapting to your skill, but it doesn't feel like that in competitive intentionally because they said they're not going to reset it. The blog post goes on, however, this still meant that it took several games for players to get where they belong. To improve this, we added a streak modifier system that tracks a moving average of a player's win rate. When a player wins more than 50% of their matches, we start to increase their MMR faster. This levels out once we see a player's MMR value as them joining fair matches, which corresponds to a 50% win rate. With this change, we've seen new and returning players reach a 50% win rate with much fewer matches than before. So what this all means, there's a bit of a win streak bump, essentially. Because as you begin to continuously win at a given MMR, it's going to scale up. So your past win streak will have an effect on your future wins to help you climb out of a rank. The faster we can calibrate a new player's MMR, the fewer unfair matches we'll create, not just for that player, but for the other 9 players in the match. Overall, we think this was a huge improvement to the new player experience, which in turn should result in better matches for everyone. There will be more information on updates in the future, but until then, please keep sharing your feedback. It's our most valuable development resource. Final thoughts. We're continuing to analyze data, tune values, and evaluate more changes to the matchmaker. Our highest hope is to make a match that feels fun for everyone, even the team that loses. We feel strongly that the best way to achieve this is to make matches that are as fair and balanced as possible. Matchmaking is a constant process of improvements and refinements. Our team is focused on making matchmaking in Overwatch 2 as good as it can be, and we have some exciting changes in the pipe that we're working on testing soon. Okay, that is meaning it's far out for us to get our hands on, but they're trialing some things out. We'll continue this conversation in part 2 of the series that dives into the competitive system in Overwatch 2. Keep an eye out for more information in the new year. Thank you for sticking with us and sharing all your thoughts with us. That's everything for the blog post, guys. Let me know your thoughts on it in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave it a like, and don't forget to hit subscribe and click the bell icon to actually get notified when our videos come out. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for your Overwatch. I'll see you guys next time.